So good day, dear colleagues, dear members of the press, and thank you for joining us for this post-event virtual press conference. My name is Laye Butaki, I'm the Director of Communication and Outreach for Academia 2063. Exactly 1 week ago, the Malabar Montpellier panel at Academia 2063 hosted the 9th edition of the Malabar Montpellier Forum to discuss policy innovations for food systems transformation, building resilience, and adapting to climate change. The highlight of this forum was the unveiling of the monograph, a report based on 7 thematic areas published by the Malabar Montpellier panel since 2017. So today we have an exciting lineup of speakers who will be telling us more about the Malabar Montpellier panel, the objectives of the forum, and the impact and relevance of the work of the Malabar Montpellier panel. We'll be hearing from Dr. Ousmane Badiane, who is Academia 2063's Executive Chairperson and Co-Chair of the Malabar Montpellier panel, Professor Joachim von Braun, Distinguished Professor at the Center for Development Research, University of Bonn, and Co-Chair of the Malabar Montpellier panel, and Professor Cheryl Hendricks, Department Head, Director of the Institute for Food, Nutrition and Wellbeing, University of Pretoria, equally a member of the Malabar Montpellier panel. This meeting is providing simultaneous interpretation. Please click on the icon, the globe icon on your screen if you want to follow the meeting in another language. And please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A chat. You will have the opportunity to raise your hand after the speakers must have made their statements. Without further ado, I will now hand over the floor to Dr. Ousmane Badiane, who is going to provide an overview of the Malabar Montpellier panel. Dr. Badiane.
Thank you, Dr. Butaki, and our colleagues for joining us here. Welcome to the members of the media who are spending the time here discussing the work of the Malabar Montpellier panel and the forum. Of course, welcome to my colleagues, Professor von Braun and Cheryl Hendricks. I'll be brief just to talk about how the work of the Malabar Montpellier panel fits in the broader agenda of Academia 2063. As you have seen in the press advisory, Academia 2063 is a Pan-African think tank with headquarters in Kigali, Rwanda, and a regional office here in Dakar. What we're trying to do is to make sure that African governments, organizations, and important stakeholder groups have access to the data and the analytics that they need for better policies, programs, and intervention design that will lead to much stronger outcomes and therefore accelerate progress across the continent. We think evidence-based policy that show the way, help countries and others to measure progress, to benchmark performance will help achieve better economic outcomes for all of our populations. So the Malabar Montpellier panel and the related forum are one of 3 continent-wide programs that we're operating at Academia 2063. But there's one on review and benchmarking and mutual learning that provides data to track progress of the African Union agenda, which we call the Regional Strategic Analysis Knowledge Support Systems. And there's another one that focuses on capacity building across the continent for policy analysis, for economic modeling, which we call Agro-Debt African Growth and Development Policy Modeling Consortium. So the Malabar Montpellier panel is the 3rd pillar of our continental level agenda. It consists of a pool of senior experts from Africa and outside of Africa who come together and do work, and my colleague, Professor von Braun, will tell you more about what that work is. So we are happy and proud to host this premier platform, panel, and related forum across Africa that helps add to the capacity of countries and organizations across the continent to be better basically equipped in terms of designing policies and programs. So I will stop here and then hand over back to Dr. Butaki and the rest of our colleagues for the conference today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Badian, for that statement, for that overview. Now I would like to invite Professor Joachim von Braun, who will tell us a little bit more about the work of the Malabar Montpellier Forum, the objectives and the scope. Professor von Braun.
Thank you, and welcome to all who are listening from the media. It's good that you take an interest in food and agriculture. The objectives and the scope of the Malabar Montpellier Forum are simply to facilitate transformation of the food and agriculture economy and sectors in Africa, for the purpose to generate higher levels of economic growth, which is already quite significant at more than 4.5% per annum. African agriculture grows at an impressive rate, but it needs to grow more sustainably with less new land coming under cultivation and more innovation coming into play. We focus on jobs and on nourishment of all people. The second purpose and scope is to bring science and knowledge together with policy, as Dr. Badiane just mentioned. But how are we doing that? We can assure you that the Malabar Montpellier panel learns as it moves forward, and we learn from successes. We are not interested in bad experiences and failure. We are interested in successes. And it turns out that each of the reports, which Cheryl Hendricks may touch upon in her statement, has lessons of successes in agricultural transformation, in growth and sustainability and nutrition, lessons to tell. Practically, you may also like to take note of the fact that we move around in Africa. Each forum, as long as COVID did not prevent us from doing this, is at a different location. And that is on purpose. We had our meetings, our forums in Rwanda, in the Gambia, in Benin, in Malawi, in Morocco. And virtual meetings were then focusing on Southern Africa, Ethiopia, and so on. Why are we moving around? Because we need to capture the diversity, the wisdom of the locations. And we need to connect to local policy making. My last point is the Malabar Montpellier panel relates to the international environment, to Europe, Asia, Americas. And it fosters relationship with the African Union in terms of reaching out internationally, because matters of trade, of sharing insights and science are international issues. The climate theme is international. So we facilitate African agricultural transformation agendas, mainly with a focus on lessons learned in Africa, but we also relate internationally. Back to our chair, Lahi Butaka.
Professor von Braun, for that statement. And now I would like to invite Professor Cheryl Hendricks to tell us more about the work and the scope of the report of the panel, the impact, its relevance to food systems transformation in Africa and the globe. Professor Hendricks, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon to the participants. The Malabar Montpellier panel reports cover some very important topics related to something that's been really topical in the last year, and that is food systems transformation. We know that Africa has some very special food systems and uniqueness, and so the reports cover some very essential contextual elements that perhaps to this point have not really been displayed and highlighted in terms of what African policymakers can do in terms of ensuring that future food systems in Africa are healthy, sustainable, and more equitable. And so each of the reports covers a topic that is very relevant to the African context. We set out initially to profile three components of the policy domain. The policies themselves, so what policy changes did governments make in relation to changes in their context and environment in response to both supply and demand functions, as well as things, for example, climate change. We also look not just at the policy context, but also to the programs that are then implemented following these policy changes. And lastly, we look at the institutional innovations that are used by governments in order to implement these. So we know that Africa is loaded with policy documents and great intent, and there's often a lot of critique about the fact that we don't move into implementation. So each of the 7 reports of the panel highlight what countries have done. And the 8th report, which is probably my favorite, called Joining the Dots, brings together the basket of ideas that successful countries have compiled in order to address the complexity in intersectoral issues in Africa. So each of these covers opportunities for growth, such as in agricultural production and productivity, agricultural processing, technology and innovation, infrastructure, interregional trade, social protection systems, which isn't always on the radar of agricultural people, and also the science, technology, and innovation. Each report has very clear examples from Africa. The digital report, for example, on digitization, has over 30 examples of African homegrown solutions to applying digitization to transforming food systems. So real life examples, they're not cooked from international literature or pie in the sky ideas, but practical ways in which African governments can consider adopting the best practices of each of the countries. So each report profiles a set of countries that are determined and identified through quite a rigorous process in a matrix of criteria, and then an in-depth explanation of why they meet that criteria. In some cases, the countries profiled are pretty surprising and not necessarily the ones you would expect to find in such a collection. But altogether, the reports cover a range of topics that really do give governments the scope and ideas of what they can be looking at in terms of comprehensive improvements to food security and food systems in Africa. So in terms of nutrition, it talks about what innovations countries have done. Irrigation looks at many of the opportunities as well as how do we fund irrigation. Mechanization brings into focus one of the elements we ignore so much, and that is on the processing side. So the upstream elements of agricultural advancement. The digitization crosses from nutrition through to many opportunities for markets. Energy highlights the fact that we cannot really transform food systems unless we do expand the capacity and the access to energy. And we need to think innovatively around clean energy and smart energy solutions. The livestock report is, of course, focused really on livestock value systems and their importance in the African landscape in terms of agriculture. trade is something that's really relevant to the African policy context, with the Interregional Africa Trade Agreement having been signed last year. So there are many different components and many different elements. As I mentioned, the Joining the Dots report shows how countries bring these elements together and create a comprehensive environment in which countries can succeed. I'll stop there for now, but hopefully provides an outline of the intent and the tempt you into reading the detail in the reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hendricks, and thank you to all our speakers for providing the context. So I would like to remind our members of the press that they can drop their questions in the Q&A. I'm monitoring the Q&A, and if you want to raise your hand, we can invite you to ask your question. I would like to, follow up with the panelists. We're talking about homegrown solutions, policy innovations. So the Malabar Montpellier panel since 2017 has published 8 reports. And the monograph, which was captioned Recipes for Success, spans 7 thematic areas. All of this is happening against the backdrop of climate change, the recently concluded COP26, and we equally have the post-UNFSS summit. With COP27 slated for next year and slated to take place on the continent, what opportunities do you see for synergy, for convergence between food systems transformation and climate change? I would like each of the panelists to weigh in on this. Professor Von Braun, would you like to go first?
Yeah, happy to. The year 2021 is a very unusual one in terms of big events, and events related to food and agriculture and economic change. And it is essential that the African voice is heard in the conferences on food, on climate, as we have just completed the Food Systems Summit of the United Nations and had the Climate Summit in Glasgow. Our Malabar Montpellier panel, together with the managing unit in Academia 2063, have had series of meetings before and after these summits. And that's important to have the African voice heard. Secondly, the key themes which Cheryl Hendricks has just outlined, and we can only scratch the surface in this brief meeting, also have one set of common insights. That is, governments at the highest level need to come together on the food and agriculture issues across departments. This is not just a matter of agriculture ministries. And that's why we have the ambition. And actually, the Malabar Montpellier panel delivers on this ambition to reach to the highest levels of decision makers with the forum and to their advisors. So if you ask the typical question, hey, what's the impact of all of this? The impact is felt through improved food and agriculture policies. But we still have miles to go. We are not in a last mile situation in the transformation of the food system in Africa. And so the Malabar Montpellier panel has a long-term perspective. I pass on to the chair again. Layi?
Thank you. Brown. Dr. Badian, would you like to weigh in on the question as well? Could you please unmute your mic?
Thank you. I'll take it from where Joachim stopped, I think. One interesting example to show how our work is thought of and how it's contributing to the broader agenda. We don't have a lot of ambitious policymakers, senior level in particular, who would like to do certain things. Our experience is that oftentimes, because of where they sit, they know that failure can be very costly. If they fail in terms of financial terms because they move large agendas, or if they fail in political terms because they're highly visible, that tend actually often to discourage the appetite for innovations, for moving things. Often you will hear from such people in those positions to say, I would like to do this and that and that, but I'm struggling to figure out where has that worked, who has done that, who has, where's an example I can look at. So what we're doing in our work is to anticipate that question, to look at a very strategic area for developmental policy and say, let's look at where things have worked in Africa in terms of action by government, institutional innovation, policy innovations, program interventions, so that if you're a leader that have an intention to do something big in that area or something small, you don't have to look around and ask yourself your questions. Where did it happen? Where did it work? We have it right there for you as a menu. And what you will see in that work, which is really interesting, is that whether you're talking about the report on nutrition or on energy or on irrigation or on mechanization, livestock or trade or food systems, the best performing African countries don't always all do the same thing. There are a few things that cut across, but each one of them, based on their realities, have found solutions. So if you are somebody who would like to do something, you have basically a menu of different options that you can pull from based on your own reality. And I think that is a major contribution of our work, and that's how we also are going to be moving the needle across Africa. Thank you. Back to the chair, Dr. Botaki.
Thank you very much, Dr. Badian. Professor Hendricks, would you like to weigh in on that before we move on to the next question?
Thank you. I guess just quickly, so if you look at each of the different reports, they all address the issue of climate change, but from the perspective of the topic that is discussed in the report. So it makes it far more important than just generalized report on climate change, but how climate change affects each one of those components and what considerations are necessary in order to weigh in on what is the most appropriate policy action for that particular context in the country. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Hendricks. We have one from Emeka Ike, and he says, as a think tank, what impact are you making in the area of food and agriculture in Africa? What should we expect in the next 5 years? Dr. Badian?
Thank you, Dr. Botaki. What you expect across the continent is, of course, you're talking about 54, 55 countries, what you expect, but there are a few things that you will see. Africa has had the best 2 decades before COVID, for example. Strongest growth rate in the history of the continent since the early 60s. Positive per capita growth rates, poverty, hunger trending down, countries scaling up investment in agriculture, almost doubling annual outlays in agricultural development and food systems compared to the 90s over the last 20 years. GDP, agriculture, and the economies have grown by almost 100%, between 2/3 and 100% over those 20 years. That was until 2015-16. And things have started slowing down then. The growth rate was already slow before COVID, and expenditures were not rising the way they were doing prior years, also before COVID. And we still, despite this, outstanding economic performance in the first 2 decades, we still have a huge underplay in terms of poverty and hunger. So what is going to change coming after COVID is first to make sure that we go back to the growth records, growth performance of the 20 years after of this the last 20 years. We are facing, just like COVID has shown us, an environment that's going to be even more challenging to do that. Climate shocks, from disease to weather to others, are going to be making development policy much more complicated. So we will have a bigger challenge in terms of having to accelerate and sustain growth, but we're doing that in the context of the changing climates. We also will have to do that in a way where the growth of the 20 years would impact on people's livelihood more than in the past. We have to bring in tools to bring in more people to reduce poverty faster and hunger, not relying just on growth, but we have to be more inventive. Social protections, programs to bring services to the rural areas, safety nets, fighting vulnerabilities in the front of a changing climate. All those things are going to be changing as we do policy. We also have to look at the quality of our food systems. It's no longer just sufficient to grow more food, but food that is much more nutritious for people to eat. We have fast changing diets due to urbanization, the rising middle class. How do we get to food processing, which is not the main source of food in the urban areas, that is healthy, less risky and safe for people, and that is connected to agriculture so that smallholder farmers can continue to grow and make money. So the need to grow is not going to change, it's same as usual, but the quality of growth, how much it affects people's livelihoods, how we change our food systems toward better, healthier, and much more resilient food systems. Those things are going to be changing in the face of a changing climate, and certainly shocks like COVID and others. So sorry for having been too long a little bit, but the question is also quite a broad one. So back to Dr. Butaki.
Thank you, Dr. Badian. Professor Von Braun, would you want to weigh in on that? What are we to expect 5 years from now?
Well, I like the question by Demeka Eke. Let me make a few practical points. What makes me optimistic for the next 5 years is, number one, digital networking. Africa actually is ahead of many South Asian countries on that score. Secondly, I expect a lot of growth and development in the dairy industry of Africa, milk. Third, I think there will be a fast dissemination of irrigation at small scale and driven by solar energy in a decentralized way. And fourth, I expect that the seeds which African farmers use will be much improved, because there have been solid investments by entities like the Consultative Group for International Agriculture Research and by AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, to invest in the seed industry, the small-scale seed industry in Africa, and that will come to have effects. And in all of these fields, the digital, the milk, the irrigation, the seeds, women will play a bigger role than in the last 20 years in farming and in food value chains. What worries me is the resilience issue, which Usman already touched upon and Cheryl earlier. The resiliency, because there will be more shock waves from floods, from droughts, from storms because of climate change. So, but it will move forward, and you will see new reports on these issues from the MaMo Malabar Montpellier panel. For instance, on bio-based economy, we call it bioeconomy, and other innovations. Back to you, Lahi Butaka.
Thank you very much, Professor Von Braun. So we have a few questions coming in. We have one from Mapio Dadia, Deputy Business Editor, Nigerian Pilot newspaper. And the question is, what is the achievement of the Malabar Montpellier panel in Africa? And how has it impacted the continent, seeing the rising rate of hunger in Africa? And the second part to that question is, how can your program help African farmers achieve more results in their agricultural system? So the first part is basically, how are we fighting hunger in Africa through this program? And how can we help African farmers achieve more results in the agricultural system? This question is open to all the panelists.
Let me get started on the first one. First, how we helping deal with the issue of hunger. Hunger is the area where African countries have more resources to get better outcomes than what they have right now, nutrition in particular. The biggest constraint today is knowing what to do, how to do good nutrition policy, which is something we have not really paid too much attention to in the past. How are we helping there? How is the panel helping? Our very first report was on nutrition. Nourished was the title of it. They will look at 6 countries that have succeeded in reducing the poverty rate by 50% over a decade. Countries like Senegal, like Rwanda, like Angola, like Morocco, and a couple more. And what we have done and what came out of that report is a menu of intervention countries can now use to reduce the rate of malnutrition, especially among young kids. They don't have to go and look for it anywhere. In each one of those countries, whether you have a community-based system in Senegal, or you have a health system-based approach in other countries, whether you have supplemented biofortification as a tool, countries have shown that it works and how it works and why it works. And that is, in that first forum that we had 6 other countries sitting around the table with those 6 leading African countries to look at the results, to look at the experiments and take it back home. So those things are being applied by the countries who attend the forums and those who read the report, but it just doesn't stop with the countries using those reports. The agencies that are working with those countries are using those reports as well and drawing from those experiences. And I think learning by experiences, seeing what your colleagues are doing, peer imitation is the best way to move the needle. And we think the work of the panel, especially that report, is going to help and is already helping countries figure ways to deal with hunger and malnutrition. So that's an example of how we help countries move the needle on hunger and nutrition. Let me stop here and let my colleagues ask the second part of the question.
Thank you, Dr. Badian. Professor Hendricks?
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the elements that the panel does is and the reports do is to bring the focus of nutrition more clearly into focus. It's often delegated to the Ministry of Health, which is not always part of a comprehensive approach to addressing hunger. We often only see hunger as producing more, as a solution to hunger to produce more food. And that's clearly not the solution for the future. So ensuring that people are well nourished and addressing the incredibly high stunting and undernourishment rates in Africa are going to take a far broader perspective. So things like social grants, making sure that we're thinking about food safety, as well as more nutritious foods in the food system. So there is a risk that our rapid transformation of food systems could focus on providing cheap calories for particularly urbanizing populations, where people are asking for more convenient foods to save time, to save energy, and of course, because of constrained budgets. And so the role of the panel is to try and highlight the necessity for particularly far more integrative, comprehensive approaches, and for those policy decisions to be made at the highest level, where this integration of different ministries and sectors takes place. So I think that's one of the major innovative components of the panel and the reports, is to bring that focus to bear. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hendricks. Professor Von Braun, would you like to conclude on this question?
Yeah, let me just add that we currently, because of a set of circumstances, are seeing rising numbers of hungry people, not only in Africa. It's the 3 C's: conflict, COVID, and climate. And we need to address those. They are partly external to Africa, partly they need to be addressed internally through resilience and conflict resolution investments, for instance, related to land rights and water rights. But we have, I think, an agenda before us to address from a rational perspective the conflict, the COVID, and the climate agenda. We have addressed the latter, but the other two, which have come upon us more and more in the last 2 years, the panel will not shy away to also discuss them with political leadership.
Thank you, Professor Von Braun. We have a couple of minutes before we conclude this virtual press conference, just enough time to tackle the few questions that we have received so far. Please recall, you can send us your name and the name of the outlet you represent. You can raise your hand equally if you want to ask your questions live. So we have one from Nation Kenya. How do you envisage women playing a role in the agriculture space, and how will you support them financially and otherwise? Dr. Badian, would you like to go first?
Thank you very much. And actually, if you're talking about women in that space, it's just not only in farming. We often talk about women being the major of farmers in Africa, but women are actually very active across the entire value chain. They don't have to be the majority, but to be really, really very active members of those value chains. Whether you're talking about trade, cross-border trade, that depends on the regions. In West Africa, it's heavily, not heavily dominated, but very strong presence of women. Where I think women is definitely dominating across the continent again is in staples processing, at least in West Africa. When you're talking about the millet sector, the cassava sector, fruit juices, traditional, those are areas where women are at the front line in leading. I think the tens of thousands of small enterprises that are behind the food processing revolution across the region are heavily dominated by women. So talking about women in agriculture, in agribusiness, in development, it is from the farm all the way to the fork. Now, what you need to do can be very broad. And by the way, one of our next reports is going to be on female economic actors and the roles, certainly most likely next year. And it's going to be looking at all the different aspects around it and which countries are doing the best in terms of equipping women in terms of productivity, creating a level playing field, meeting their needs and resources. Now, how do you do that? First, by avoiding bias in what you do. You don't even have to be pro-women to do that, because women are there to compete every day, day in, day out, and they are making success. But you have to be focused on their needs and what they do. We have a report recently that looked at how Senegal, for example, was promoting the emerging agri-industries. And you look at policies that are more geared towards larger enterprises, much more formal enterprises, for example, where most of the smaller enterprises, more informal, are dominated by women. You may want to help women in that context, but because you're not focusing and you're not meeting them where they are, you wouldn't do that. But where they are, they're very competitive. So if you're there, all you need to do is to basically create the opportunity for them to do what they do and do better. So I think that if you go into farming, you'll find the same thing. If you go into trading in particular, there we did a work on Niger, where we looked at the issues around women traders and the kind of networks they engage in, the kind of obstacles they face, the kinds of institutional issues were very different from those that men were facing. If the policy doesn't reflect that, then it doesn't work. So what we think going forward is that people are being more and more aware of these gender issues. What we contribute there is in our data, in our analytics, in our review, in our impact assessment, that we specifically address the gender dimension so that people can measure and see what the needs are and what the progresses are. But I think that the women are very strongly positioned to compete both in farming and in agro-industries. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Badian. Before we move on to the next question, maybe a few words from Professor Hendricks on the gender issue.
I'm not sure women are there, and I think if we look at innovative solutions, as Dr. Badian has mentioned, further along the value chain, there are many, many opportunities that women can take up and that are innovative. And governments are starting to see this. Many, many governments have specific programs for reaching women and targets, particularly in the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Programs, for meeting the needs of women through financing, through providing equipment and inputs. But it takes a shift, I guess, away from our traditional subsidies to looking at how we can be more creative in creating opportunities across the value chain rather than just focusing on the production component. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Hendricks. We have one from Tracy, Tracy from Nation Media Group, Uganda. The impact of climate change has changed seasons. Farming is becoming more complicated than ever across the continent. Without irrigation, farming is almost no longer possible. How best can small-scale farmers address the issue of irrigation, given limited startup capital, knowledge, and resources? Professor Von Braun, would you like to start?
That's a very important question. No farmer can be successful alone. We need mechanisms for collective action, as we call it. Cooperation, cooperatives, or contract farming, where groups of farmers come together, even around small-scale irrigation. You rightly point to the issue of climate stress, which requires more drip irrigation, not flood irrigation, because the water is too scarce. And That does not cost so much. The energy needs to come from solar panels. That's well developed. Currently, this equipment is mainly purchased by those startup enterprises in Africa, purchased from India, but Africa can develop its own industries around innovative production technology. So that would be my main focus. Irrigation, you point at, must be at the center, and that's why the Malabo Montpellier panel has issued a report on that, and it's still very up to date and worthwhile, your reporting.
Professor Von Braun, since we are pressed for time, we'll move on to the next question. So we have one from Lucas, and I'm summarizing the question here. Basically, how do you get to report your findings, this evidence, to politicians who are in the driver's seat and might not necessarily have the knowledge to tackle these issues? So how do you translate these findings and communicate them to political leaders? Dr. Badian?
Thank you very much. First of all, the format we have is our best way of transmitting this knowledge. As we said, we start with picking an area of very strategic importance to Africa. We just talked about irrigation, we have the report water-wise. Then we develop a methodology to look at the top 6 or 7 performers. Then we write the reports on what they're doing right and how and why they're succeeding. Now, the transmission of that knowledge takes place through the forum in a small setting at the ministerial or permanent secretary level. We take 6 people from those 6 countries where we did the case study to show what's working, and we invite another 6 or 7. They sit in one room for half a day, not only to hear from us what we have synthesized, but to ask each other questions in the how-tos and why and how comes. So that first group that leaves not only with the knowledge in our reports, but also with the feedback and exchange with the colleagues. And as we repeat those forums, the more opportunity we have people at that level to sit. The importance is that we get them for a lapse of time where they're available and sit and focus on this, not while they're going into a place or coming out of a place or through a report they have to read. They sit with their colleagues and their peers, they hear the evidence we have, and they ask each other questions and clarify that. We think that's a much more impactful way of imparting knowledge than just through reporting in other ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Badian. We have a couple of questions, but I see some intersections, so I'm going to share the questions in groups since we are running out of time. We have one from Bogonko Nyokangi Santima, and he's asking about how we are planning to reach rural areas, mostly marginalized countries. I think this is equally in line with the question on which goes thus. Despite the economic growth, Africa still faces challenges such as rapid population growth, persistent economic inequality, climate change threats, droughts, youth unemployment, undernourishment, and food insecurity. What is expected from Africa's political leadership in particular to address the above mentioned challenges? Dr. Badian?
Started again. Thank you for that good questions. It has 2 parts that's really important to focus on. Africa has had the best 2 decades of our post-colonial history since 2000. So there's been a lot of progress and a lot of positive change. Yet, because we started from a very tough situation, from the 70s to the 90s, all these indicators were red, really dark red, were really in a very tough place. So what we have done since 2000 is just getting out of that deep hole, But what's important with that is that we know now how to get things done and to do them right. So we have not made that big impact on poverty, on inclusion, all those kind of things because of where we were in the 70s and 80s. But you look at the track record of the 20s, the good and reassuring thing is that we have now figured out how to make things move. We just have to accelerate and scale things up. And that's where our work comes in. The only way you can scale up and accelerate, if you get people to know exactly what worked so well over the last 20 years and do that in a magnified way across different countries so that it can scale up. Now, on hunger and poverty and marginalization, you cannot rely on growth to do that. You'll have to get new tools to make sure growth impacts on everybody. Social safety nets, ways of getting assets to marginalized people, providing social services into the rural areas. You talk about health, you talk about education, providing infrastructure. We know how to do those things now. So, and where countries are focused on that, they have made progress. So when you're growing, that's when you have the best conditions to deal with equity, inclusions, and vulnerability. And we have been growing over the last 20 years. We have not learned yet how to do those things, but we're starting to get smarter at that. And COVID has shown how vulnerable our communities are. Therefore, tackling vulnerability through inclusion and equity, but also through understanding the shocks and making our economies and agriculture much more resilient. You just had the questions of irrigation and others. So we know how to do things now. This is different from where we were 20 years ago. We know where they work, we just need to do more of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Badian. So we're going to take one last question and then we'll come back to the panelists to give their final conclusion before we close. This is from Rabeb Aloui from Tunisia. It's actually a two-part question. The first part is, how can agricultural systems be adapted to tackle climate change? I think you have touched on that a little earlier today. And how can gender equality be achieved through agriculture? Professor Hendricks, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I suppose it starts with recognizing the role of women in the economy and the role that women play as providers in their homes, as livelihood champions, and as actors in the economy. And more voices being given to women to be able to express their needs, what specifically they need in order to play a more active and advancing role in food systems and agricultural systems in Africa. So we know that women form the backbone of the economy, but a lot of that effort has been unseen in the economics and also in society, and things are changing. I really do believe that there's more emphasis on empowerment of women in very practical ways and the recognition of women. And we see a number of things changing. If we could see the same changes in the science, technology, and innovation intakes that we see at university that were dominated by men 20 years ago and are now outnumbered by women in the top performers as well in our classes, I think we start to see that there is a significant shift. And the more policymakers we get who are women, who have that deeper empathy for people on the ground and an understanding of the roles of women, I think we will see things change. So we will see things shifting from just ticking the box by mentioning gender in a policy to actually understanding and challenging what gender equity means. It's not just all about women. Men need to step up as well, for example, in child nutrition, to play a crucial role, ensuring that children are protected and nourished. So I think things are changing, and perhaps we need to give more credit and more visibility to the change that is happening, while acknowledging that there are still many women who are vulnerable to violence, for example, and exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hendricks. So now we're coming to the end of this virtual press conference, and I would like to invite the speakers to give some final thoughts. We started the conference with some strong words from the co-chairs of the Malabar Montpellier Forum, His Excellency Haile Mariam Desalegn and Her Excellency Bentala Assia Alawi, who spoke about the work of the Malabar Montpellier Forum. And I recall that during the closing, Her Excellency Bentala Alawi said that in the past, agriculture was seen more like a thing for the poor, for people in the rural areas. But now with all the innovations, with the value, with the skills building, it provides an opportunity to retain our youth on the continent. How important is that in your opinion? Your final thoughts before we close. Dr. Badian?
Thank you. Quickly, especially agriculture and the youth. I think we also had the questions on how to make agriculture much more climate resilient. And I'm sure Professor Van Braun will have a couple of words to add to that. If I had to have one word, it's really science and technology. We will need, before I get to the youth, but it is connected to the youth, science and technology is what we'll need to get the drought-tolerant varieties, to get the disease and pest-tolerant varieties, to get nitrogen-efficient varieties that allow us to use less fertilizers and less water, and even cultivate in marginal areas. So the institution around that, the technologies, the private sector delivers it. That's really how we're going to get into having a climate resistant and resilient agriculture. It's science, it's technology, the foundations. Now, indeed, if agriculture grows, and the way it should grow, because it's not only just a business, it's also a very science-based business, actually. Countries where agriculture moves is countries where technology innovates and new tools, new methodologies, new practices are extended. If agriculture starts to be technology intensive in Africa, where we use biotechnology, we use digitalization, we use off-grid energy innovations, we will not only start creating value addition to farming, but also we'll be attracting the youth to get into that. So the second pillar to get youth into agriculture is a system for training and upgrading, not just going to college or to secondary school, but having places where existing farmers, young farmers can go for training, for mentorship, for simple courses that don't require them to have all the way to go to finishing high school or college. We haven't figured out how to do professional and vocational training in our countries that is mainstream, not based on project. But we need to invest in that, just like we invest in elementary schools, places where kids can go for a week, for a month, for 2 months, for a year, for 3 years to get trained on different parts of agriculture, not just on farming, but across the value chain. How you change oil in a tractor, how you manipulate a machine in a fruit juicing company, how you work in marketing in agribusiness. Those are professions that need to be learned. And having a place where you can go and be trained, not having to go to a whole full normal school system, but just a parallel training system. That's where we need to go. Our reports have shown that countries that have those parallel skills development and upgrading systems, like Ethiopia, like Morocco, it has served them very well, not just in developing agriculture, but in attracting and retaining youth in the agriculture sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Badian. Professor Hendricks?
Thank you so much. I would say, clearly, youth are our future. So it's very important that youth have a voice in policy decisions in order to ensure that we're able to address the high unemployment rates amongst youth. The youth are the innovators. They're the people who are very comfortable with digital technology and have the opportunities to identify new opportunities for creating new entrepreneurial opportunities and job creation. So I would really appeal to youth to get involved and for policymakers to engage with youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hendrik. Professor von Braun, final thoughts?
Well, connecting back to the question from Tunisia by Rabib Aloui, the climate threat is for real, especially in the Mediterranean area. And the investment in science to understand the local and regional climate change in North Africa is very important because it will be a hotspot. Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and the neighborhood. What, given current knowledge, will be extremely important is that the high value agriculture segments become climate resilient, not only the field crops. So the olives, the fruits, the vegetables, they create jobs in growing and trading and processing, and they are threatened, including the olives, with new diseases. So I don't want to close this important consultation with you on a gloomy note, because science, as Usman Badiane and Cheryl Hendricks have underlined, plays a key role to transform the food system. If you look into the statement, and I encourage you to do so, of this UN Secretary General, released on September 23rd at the Food Systems Summit, it has written science and innovation all over the 3-page statement. We must take this seriously in implementing the actions. Then agriculture and the food system in Africa will be more resilient, more prosperous, and create the jobs, including for women. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor von Braun. Thank you, Professor Hendricks, Dr. Badiane, for your time. Thank you to our colleagues from the press for joining this virtual press conference. We have now come to the end of this meeting. Please look at the chat box for links to our resources, to our reports, to our website. Our hashtags are #MaMo panel and #MaMo forum. Stay tuned. Thank you for joining us and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, Lai.